Hello, dear listeners. I am joined by Amy Hollenkamp, RD, from the IBS
everybody.
Podcast.
How's it going?
I thought I'd mix it up a little bit. I probably creeped everybody out and they're going to log off now. But, you know, we always talk about like my high energy introductions. I wanted to like mix it up.
Yeah. You did a good job.
Thank you. Thank you. So, dear listeners, dear viewers, today is a big, big topic. It's one of my personal favorites. I don't know about you, Amy, but today we're going to be talking about mast cells and a histamine intolerant, allergenic type of immune picture. And then next week, we're going to talk about the low histamine diet and how to incorporate antihistamine foods into your diet and what all that will entail. So today we're taking a deep dive into essentially the immunology of IBS, honestly.
Yeah.
You can think of it that way because there's a boatload of research in regards to IBS with mast cells. But Amy, speaking of which, care to kick us off and give us a little bit of something to go off of, and then we'll let the conversation unfold.
Yes. It's always kicked to me to get the convo started, isn't it?
I do the intro, you do the first words. We have a system here.
Yeah, we do. So I think when it comes to like the mast cells histamine situation in SIBO and IBS, like to me, I feel like there's almost a spectrum. I don't know if you sort of view it in this way where like some of my clients don't really necessarily have the really strong histamine style reactions, but I know they might still have some histamine stuff going on. But then there's the people that have very overt histamine reactions that need a lot more intervention and support with controlling the histamine. So like from my standpoint, when I think of histamine and mast cell stuff, I sort of think of it as that continuum that everyone probably with IBS has some level or like usually has some level of histamine response. Sometimes it's not really going to manifest in symptoms, but other times it can be very symptomatic. That's generally how I sort of view it in my head.
Yeah, and I agree. I think actually I'll confess, I joke sometimes with my friends that I think I have a touch of histamine stuff. Yeah. But it's mild enough that I'm willing to put up with it. And I have not yet embarked on any sort of like histamine lowering diet effort because it's not, you know, I don't, and I'm going to knock on wood and not jinx myself. Like I don't get migraines. I don't get, you know, hives or eczema or, you know, a lot of the stuff like really bad anxiety attacks, you know, the POTS type of symptoms. Like I don't get anything so severe that I can't put up with it. If anything, it's like after I eat certain foods, I'll notice that I have a lot of congestion and I'll kind of like do that a lot after my meals. And that seems to be my kind of worst symptom that I deal with on a day-to-day. So to me, it's like not worth the effort to try to do anything about it beyond what I already do for my immune system. So you could have people like me who have, you know, one or two minor symptoms that's kind of like an allergenic histaminic profile. Or you could have people where the pendulum has swung violently the other way and now they have full-blown mast cell activation disorder, and it's like a named medical condition, and like their mast cells are having a jamboree. But let's rewind for a hot second, because actually I should have kicked us off with this. If people are wondering, what are mast cells? That might be a better place to start really quickly. And that is, so we are talking about cells of your immune system. These are part of what they call the innate immune system. So they're always there. They're always kind of hanging out around blood vessels, around the gut, under the skin. They're always just chilling out, waiting for stuff to get weird. And they're waiting to help you and protect you from pathogens or parasites or allergens or some sort of exposure that they deem a threat. So really, when we're talking about mast cells, we're talking about one type of immune cell that is always going to be in your body. It's always going to be there. The goal is not to be free of mast cells, but the key is that you want them to be reasonably calm or pacified. And an analogy, I don't think it was in reference to mast cells, but I think it was Karazian actually said something about like, oh no, it was microglia, but I think it still stands. He likened microglia, and I'm going to borrow this from mast cells, and say that they can kind of be like really irritable chihuahuas with bazookas.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like, you want your chihuahuas to be chill and, like, taking a nap and wearing a cute little sweater around your house. You don't want chihuahuas that are barking at everything and nipping at people's ankles and, like, shooting stuff with bazookas. And that's what irritated, hypervigilant, degranulated mast cells are kind of like. Like, they're like offloading their stuff on everybody. And it doesn't make for a whole lot of fun for the person who has those mast cells. So that's kind of the way to think of them for a starting point.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really good summary, because I think sometimes people are like, oh, mast cells are bad, histamine's bad. But like, there is a need for histamine and there is a need for mast cells in the body. Oh, yeah. And it's always important to remember that. It's just kind of, you want to make sure they're regulated in a good way so that they're not kind of overactive, like what you're describing with the Chihuahua situation.
The
yes.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't, overzealous is not always pleasant. Right. But also it makes you wonder if your mast cells are trying to protect you from something. Right? And that's like what happens when they're activated. It kind of begs the question, what are my mast cells freaking out about? Like, why do they think I need protection?
Right.
And that's where you could go back and try to address the root causes of like, all right, are they freaking out because I have SIBO or dysbiosis or candida or a parasite or Lyme disease or mold exposure? Like, what are the inflammatory triggers or the infectious triggers that are making my mast cells go bonkers? Because it's not like they just sat there and thought, oh, this would be fun.
Right.
It's like, it's not like that. Like, they had to have a reason.
Today.
Yeah, let's have a bazooka party, guys.
Right.
Like, there had to be something that pushed them into that state of overzealous function. I don't even want to say they're dysfunctional, because I think, like, who are we to judge? Yeah,
there's a reason to why they're overactive. And I think that's always good to remember. And with all gut issues, I feel like there's always so many layers. Like, sometimes you get to one layer, like, oh, I have SIBO. What's going on, like, with these symptoms? Like, you kind of got to dig further into the layers. Oh, it's low stomach acid. Well, why is my stomach acid low? You got to dig. It's the same thing with, I feel like, with mast cells. It's like, okay, so you have this mast cell issue and high histamines. Well, what are the factors that are driving my histamine up? Yeah. I think that you're totally right on. You kind of have to continue to dig to the layers, and that's where you're going to find the most helpful solutions.
Yeah, I agree. It's the root causal stuff that we're so fond of.
Right.
Because honestly, like, it's easy and it's tempting to just say, oh, I will live on Singulair for the rest of my life. But that's not ultimately going to get you where you want to go, especially if you do have one of those more aggressive forms of histamine intolerance and you do have, like, mast cell activation. Then you might need to really tell them to chill out much more intentionally and much more strongly, I guess. Like, there are people where little bit of quercetin goes a long way, end of story, they're fine. And then some people where, like, you might want to consider prescriptions, you might want to consider more aggressive doses of antihistamines. So depends on the person.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, I know we've touched on histamine stuff just throughout our discussions. And I think, like, from my standpoint, with things like SIBO or dysbiosis, like, just going over what sort of creates the histamine issues. Like, I think, you know, when you have a situation like SIBO or imbalances and you have gut bacteria creating a lot of inflammation, maybe more permeability, that's going to, again, your immune system's going to be like, hey, like, we need to protect you. We're going to produce histamine. So that's kind of one way that SIBO and imbalances causes that. I think there's certain bacteria as well that produce more histamine.
Can you speak much to that? Because I don't know. I know the general premise that happens, that some bacteria can make histamine and some can break it down. I don't know how much we truly know about that. Like, I remember looking it up because I tried to make a list of, like, histamine approved probiotics for my mast cell patients. And I remember scouring the internet, and I looked a lot at, like, the Low Histamine Chef's website. And I tried to go on PubMed, and I was actually really surprised that this is something people talk about it on the internet all the dang time, that like certain probiotics might create histamine or break it down. But I found that there's actually a severe lack of actual like human data or any like noteworthy data. I found some research, I think it was, they were studying it in like wine and sausages, I want to say, where they were looking at bacterial cultures in those two foods that impacted histamine levels in the foods. But like, I think it's actually a really big question mark clinically. But I'm curious if you have noted any probiotics or any bacteria, like if it shows up on a stool test, would it make you think, oh, histamine for sure?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think sometimes it takes looking at how someone's presenting, but there's certain bugs that I feel like I'll look out for as being like, oh, maybe more histamine producer if it's high on their tests. Things like Klebsiella tends to be a histamine producer.
I do remember reading that. Yeah.
Morganella's more of a histamine producer.
Yeah.
Enterobacteria in general tend to be more histamine producing. So again, like you kind of want to take in the full picture. I agree with you. I think like the bacteria that can like degrade it or that are good for histamine situations, I think we could have more data on. But I do think that there's kind of some evidence of the ones that produce histamine. And so when I see those again, like sometimes I'm like, oh, it makes me wonder, like, and usually I might question, oh, are they having any histamine reactions? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or even for some people, you know, like I know all of those bacteria are on the GI map, for example. And when I was running the GI map, sometimes it would also be a conversation of like, okay, we know you have histamine intolerance or mast cell issues. And we happen to find this on the stool test, and it would be a question mark, but like an optimistic question mark for people. Like, okay, when we treat this effectively, maybe your histamine reactions could go away. And I don't know if that was simplistic thinking on my part, but I think sometimes it gave people like a glimmer of hope that like this sucky kind of reaction that they're experiencing could go away. I don't know if I have any like really clear data on that where that was like always the case with one or another bacteria, but it was always kind of like a glimmer of hope for people. Like, okay, we know that this bacteria could be making histamine, so let's see what happens, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't know if I have like clear data on that. It's just something I sort of, when I'm reviewing their case, if I see something like that and they're having more histamine type reactions, kind of like something of note. I don't necessarily know if I'd go into the rabbit hole of like just focusing in on that. But I think like, again, there's some evidence that certain bacteria can produce histamine, and that could be adding to your load. Probably not the only thing adding to your load if you have other imbalances, and you kind of have to analyze the whole environment. But I also think with any sort of inflammation at play, it can lead to lower DAO enzymes that kind of break down histamine. And then there can be the genetic component in there if you have some SNPs that predispose you to a little bit lower DAO. But yeah, I think again, like, usually when there's like SIBO or imbalances, that inflammation is going to potentially do a number that drives histamine up. And again, sometimes we could hypothesize that maybe some of these bacteria are adding into the load as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wonder also, like, it probably is a cross-feeding mechanism, if you think. So I also wonder, like, okay, even if we're hypothesizing that your bacteria are, and I'm going to use air quotes, we could hypothesize that your bacteria are making too much histamine.
Yeah.
But also, what if your bacteria are making their normal amount of histamine, but the bacteria that would normally consume the histamine have dwindled?
Yeah.
And it's actually that your histamine consumers are too low.
Right.
Right? Because, like, it kind of like, we could flip it on its head just in the same way that we do with SIBO and Candida and everything else.
Right.
Like, okay, you could take kind of the allopathic approach and say, oh, this bad guy is too high. We need to nuke it. Mm-hmm. But then it also makes you wonder, well, could we get the same effect or better if we just nurture the good bacteria that would normally degrade histamine for us? And we don't even have to touch the quote unquote bad guys because they're really not bad after all?
Right. Maybe. No. Maybe. I think that's such a great point. It's like we can't just hone in on like a one bacteria that's producing histamine and saying, oh, well, that's the problem. Like it's definitely analyzing the whole environment and what your whole microbiome's doing. Mm-hmm. But that's so true with like every gut situation. It's so easy to like hone in on that one marker that's high on a stool test and be like, oh, I just have to take care of this overgrowth of this one microbe. Yeah, but it one can magic critter. Right. It could be so much more so much more complex than that.
Yeah. And I do think, allopathic medicine, bless their hearts, they've trained us to look for the bad guys. Yeah. And they've trained us to look for the broken parts of ourselves so well that even for us, who I feel like you and I are pretty like holistic, integrative, etc. But like even people in this line of work who are pretty well up on this kind of train of thought, like even we can fall into that at times and like go into, oh, the bad bacteria. But I don't know, to be clear, like before we get a bunch of YouTube comments, I don't necessarily know which bacteria consume histamine. I'm hypothesizing that there's a cross-feeding relationship. But I don't know off the top of my head, A, if that's true or if that's ever been researched, and B, I don't know the names of the bacteria, so I can't help with that in the moment. Yeah. But yeah, it's compelling to think that way because it tends to be true elsewhere. Yeah. Like whenever we look at other quote unquote bad things, even like D-lactate is consumed by just as many bacteria as it's produced by. Yeah. And here we are kind of demonizing it and talking about it like it's a bad thing, but it's probably just part of a cross-feeding relationship, and one or both of those sides of the seesaw are out of whack. Right. And you might get more mileage out of feeding the good guys than trying to obliterate the D-lactic acid producers. So, right.
Right. Yeah, it's like such a delicate balance. And I think if you lose sight of that, it tends to go poorly from what I've seen.
Yeah. Well, certainly if you go through, trying to obliterate all the bad guys and you pay no attention to the good guys, then
I think we tend to see the patients and clients that have gone overboard. And so we sort of see the collateral damage more often than I think other practitioners might. Because we're the, third, fourth, fifth provider versus the first. I always love when I get like a very fresh, like SIBO or IBS person. It's like,
they're like a baby. Like they haven't become jaded by the world yet, and you could just like cradle them. Yeah. And do like two different things, and then they're good, and you're like, go forth, my youngster.
Yes. I love it. I know. Wow. I love that. It's like, once in a blue moon, I feel like that it happens. But it's always interesting, like just starting with someone and kind of setting them on the right path early is a totally different experience than kind of trying to dig someone out of a hole. But yeah, I think that it's always a good reminder just to kind of be careful with your microbes. It's such a delicate situation. So.
Yeah. And they love you. They want to be good little roommates, but sometimes they just are imbalanced and they don't know how. Yeah. Okay, well, let's think some other things. So certainly we rattled off a few already. So things that can perturb your mast cells or make them degranulate, which is to say that they're going to bleh and regurgitate all of their histamine and prostaglandins and whatever else they have in them. They're going to spew it out and do the things that they do. Other things that can cause degranulation. So we talked about SIBO or dysbiosis of whatever variety, whether it be candida, parasite, bacteria, whatever. As we learn more about the viruses in our gut, the bacteriophages, I would be really curious if a bacteriophage type of dysbiosis could do the same thing. Probably. We just don't know yet because it's so under-researched. Certainly things like chronic infections like Lyme disease or chronic exposures like mold could also aggravate an allergic response and aggravate mast cells. And as a side note, mast cells are part of the allergic response. It's like you can picture your immune system as two sides of a seesaw, where normally you would have a little bit of both, right? Like one side of the seesaw is really good at obliterating parasites, like worms, that sort of stuff. But also it's good at churning out histamine and antibodies and mucus and phlegm and that sort of stuff. So it's like the allergic side of the immune system. And then the other side of the immune system is good at dealing with smaller things like bacteria and viruses and candida and to a certain extent tumors. So oftentimes the seesaw will go like this, where the allergic side of the immune response is heightened and the antiviral, antibacterial, anti-candida side of the immune response is somewhat dampened as a result of that, because as these cells make chemicals like histamine, it will naturally suppress the other side of the immune system because your body assumes that you need like full steam ahead. If you have a parasite, you don't want to have a little bit of a parasite response. You want to have the biggest, most intense anti-parasitic response ever. So you have these mechanisms where like one side of the immune system, when it's activated, will naturally suppress the other side. But then that's where people can sometimes get stuck. Like their immune system might not get the memo to kind of cool it back off and chill out again. And those mast cells are still spewing their guts and getting, the bazookas or whatever. And they're still going bananas. But a lot of the mast cell symptoms and a lot of histamine intolerant symptoms will closely mirror that of an allergic response. So things like food allergies, environmental allergies and phlegm and mucus, things like asthma, eczema, hives, migraines. A lot of these have like allergic foundations to them. And part of that picture is the mast cell piece of it, but there are other cells involved, just to be clear. It's like a whole side of the equation. I forget where I was going with that train of thought. Maybe you have another thought to throw in there, Amy, because I don't know where I was going with that one.
No, you're totally fine. Yeah, I think like I did want to mention, because I know we've talked about in the past, in terms of things that could promote a histamine response, we've talked about stress can be huge with histamine. So again, and stress is so broad, I feel like too, but like any sort of just stressor in your body that's going to promote a stress response could, degranulate mast cells, lead to more of a histamine type response. Yeah. So I did just want to make sure we at least we are like the stress. I feel like we are the stress uncoverers or something, like the stress highlighters, like that you need to like highlight stress management all the time. Yeah. Yeah, I think pretty much every episode we talk about it at least once. Right. Because it's important. Yeah. It's huge. And I think, again, like with things like histamine intolerance, and I know we'll talk about like dietary things next episode, but like I feel like the stress of like, oh, now I'm histamine intolerant, and you can go down the same kind of rabbit holes as like low FODMAP or like just get very restrictive. And the stress of that is probably not going to be overly helpful and could probably, again, your microbiome might change more. And like, there's just so many ramifications of adding more stress to the system. Yeah, it snowballs. Yeah, it does snowball. So I just think, again, like whenever you're going to try an intervention, like you almost always want to kind of weigh in, like, what will this do? Yeah. How stressful will this be? Like, will the stress of this take away the productivity side of this? So I just wanted to kind of add that in because I think it's really important from a mast cell standpoint. Yeah, and I do think too, like, how do I put this in the best way possible?
Like, be open-minded and mentally flexible to a point where you can recognize if this is truly an issue for you.
Right.
But also be open-minded and mentally flexible enough that you don't automatically, like, latch onto this and ignore what your body's telling you or what your labs are showing you. Because I've had patients where, like one lady, it was a while ago I worked with her, but I remember she specifically found me because she typed in, like, histamine Dr. Chapelale or something like that. Because I work with the histamine intolerant and mast cell patients quite a lot.
Yeah.
And she found me in a Google search, and she came in and she like anxiety, like 10 out of 10 anxiety.
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure she cried like 3 times at our first appointment, and I'm not a scary person. And we both were cool about it. But you know, she was that highly anxious, absolutely stressed out of her mind. And she told me right out the gate, she's like, I'm histamine intolerant. I know I'm histamine intolerant. I have X, Y, and Z going on. And it turned out she wasn't. Like, we did some labs. Now, side note, diagnosing mast cell disorders is notoriously difficult. Like, you will probably get numerous false negatives before you get a positive test if you think that you have a mast cell condition. But we did just some testing as a starting point, and we talked about her symptoms, talked about her history, and I really had a strong hunch. I was like, I really don't suspect histamine intolerance for you. The thing for her is that she had Lyme disease, and she had been on prescription antibiotics for 3.5 years.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so her microbiome was tanked, and, you know, she was really trying to get rid of any remnant Borrelia in her system. And she came into me taking probably 30 different herbal supplements. Yeah. At least. And it was literally like she or her provider or both Googled, was like, herbs for Lyme disease. And like every single one of them, she was on. No, really, like, honestly, that's how they did it. And it was just like every single one. So if they read another, you know, a blog or a video or something that said that maybe resveratrol was good, like, oh, that goes in the mix on top of everything else. So she was on a gajillion different supplements. She had whittled her diet down to about 10 foods. And then we did some stool testing, and her microbiome was in rough shape. Between the antibiotics and the restricted diet, I forget now, her diversity score, like, actually we used Ubiome at the time. It was still open. And they used to give some sort of a marker. I think they might have called it like a diversity index score. Yeah. And they based it off of the thousands of samples that they had collected. And they basically like plotted as a bell curve, and they tell you what percentile you're in amongst the people they had collected data on. And she was in like the 2nd percentile.
Oh no. Yeah.
Yeah. And that changed. Like, her gut improved tremendously when she added foods back in. But we ended up working a lot more on that and on the stress and anxiety piece of it. But she was a good example where she was 100% convinced that she was histamine intolerant. And I don't know if she really loved me in that moment when I gently brought up the idea that, hey, but maybe you're not.
Yeah.
And we kind of like explored that together. And then it turned out she really genuinely did not have a histamine response to food. Yeah. And she really didn't have to do half of what she was doing. So we actually ended up whittling down her supplement list substantially, and we introduced a lot more foods. But, you know, be mentally flexible going both directions. Don't like settle on histamine and then ignore what your body's telling you or ignore what lab testing is suggesting to you. Like, be open-minded enough that you could think like, well, maybe it's a histamine thing, but maybe it's something else. Maybe I need to explore other things.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the histamine intolerant rabbit hole is like, it just sucks you down into like, because like so many foods, I think it's even worse than low FODMAP in my opinion, from a food restriction standpoint. And I think, you know, like what I said at the beginning, like there's a spectrum. So like,
yes,
even some people that might have these mild symptoms, like you were talking about, like, oh, you might have like some mild histamine symptoms, but it's not necessarily enough to go to like these interventions that are extreme or, you know, I think there's people that, you know, might have a few like very minor things. And like you're saying, like maybe you do some quercetin, maybe you just work on their gut and some of the symptoms get better. So there's kind of like even if you do exhibit some histamine type reactions that are kind of inflammatory based, if you can kind of get the inflammation and the gut in better shape, sometimes those will just go away on its own. Sometimes you need more like herbal interventions, things like that. Sometimes you need pharmaceutical interventions. So there's a lot of different varieties of ways that you could go down it, from like, oh, we're going to like keep an eye on it and try some other things first and see if the symptoms go down. Then maybe you do something like a quercetin. And so there is like a spectrum of how aggressive you are with the mast cells, like a lot of other things. But I just think, again, like it's one of those areas I would work closely with someone and kind of, like what you're saying, trust kind of what feels right in terms of the level of intervention.
I think feels right is a good way to put it, because again, it's like tune into what your body's actually feeling and telling you.
Right. Do you mean not to listen to Google and what not to eat lists, Nikki?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I feel like we throw shade on the regular and I love it, but you know, I never want to be the practitioner who has like, you know, those asshole mugs that are like, don't confuse your Google search with my medical degree.
Right.
Like, I never want to be that jerk who's like,
I hate that too.
Like you're not allowed to Google patient of mine.
Right.
Oftentimes people just Google the crap out of everything because they have to.
Right.
Because nobody's helped them. So it's like Google and Facebook groups and summits and books, like and podcasts, they could be wonderful up to a certain point. And then you probably do want to get somebody who's objective and able to like really see the whole case to help you with this. Because like you can lead yourself down rabbit holes and not see the light of day for a very long time if you're not careful, especially if you have a brain that's a little bit more wired to be anxious and more wired to overthink things. I know, like, my husband is the type, like, he'll fall down a Google rabbit hole and he will just get sucked down and think that we are doomed.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit better because I'm a little bit more like, oh, what will be, will be. I can detach a little bit more than he can. So it depends on your nature and like how much you would stress yourself out. But like you said, falling down the rabbit hole and stressing yourself out and having anxiety because of it is then going to degranulate your mast cells. And then you're going to be really histamine intolerant. So it's like, you know, be curious, but not obsessed.
Right. And I think that's a good way to put it. I think be curious, not obsessed, and also listen to your body and what feels right. So I think that pairing that is so important, because what I see when the problem starts with like some of the Facebook forums and like groups and podcasts and things, like if you're just listening to like all the advice, which is I'm sure very varied across different forums, and not able to listen to your body, like there's so much noise and that sort of, I feel like, takes people out of their bodies so that they're not able to listen in to what is actually working. Like, never let these Google searches and podcasts and things like that, except this podcast. Listen to everything. Obviously. Just kidding. But never let any, like, sort of Google search basically pull you out of your body, is what I'm kind of saying. Like, you should still feel good doing the things you're doing, and your body has a lot of innate wisdom. So if you're not feeling good doing something, or if it just feels too stressful, or you know, it's not really helping, don't just kind of go down. Sometimes we have or at least I have the tendency to like go down a rabbit hole more. Well, I just need to restrict more histamines, like, you know, or I just need to restrict more FODMAPs, or whatever it turns out being. But I think sometimes we can kind of make some wrong turns if we're not listening in closely. Yeah,
I like that. I think, you know, another way to think of it is just don't let that energy and that type of information drive the bus. Like, it could be in the passenger seat and be there with you, but your experience of your body should always come first, regardless. And I tell that to my patients. I'm like, no matter what I tell you, and my smarty pants brain thinks that it has figured out about you and your SIBO and your whatever, like, your experience is always going to be numero uno. And then it's both of our jobs to try to make sense of that and learn from it and lead you down a good path. But like, I might think that, I don't even know, like, I might think that this probiotic is great for you, but if you feel like crap on it, I'm not going to dispute that. I'm going to try to understand why, or I'm going to get you on a different probiotic.
Right.
Done. Like, but I'm not going to be the person who tells you like I remember a patient of mine, she was working with a health coach prior to working with me. And, oh God, what was it? Shoot, I just had a little bit of a brain fart. Where to go? Basically, I remember her, like the health coach, basically like kind of teaching her to tune out from her body in some way. And I remember it being really irritating. Like, when we were on the call, it might have been when this was a coach that she was like, okay, gluten, dairy, soy, corn, all grains, all nuts and seeds, all oxalates, all sugar, never again. Never.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
And, like, the woman, she was like, you know, I could be gluten-free forever. I could be, you know, a couple of these, like, I could do that forever. I could see that. But, like, when I've had nuts and seeds, like, I don't feel like they are doing anything bad to me. And... like, I think she was losing weight. Like, she needed the calories, too. She was like, you know, is it true I can never have nuts again? Like, my body feels okay when I eat them. And I was like, no, sweetie, you eat the nuts and you love them. Like, you go for the gold. But, and I've seen cases like that where, like, another practitioner or a health coach or somebody taught their patient to specifically, like, your body's wrong. Oh, I remember another one. It was similarly, I think it was a health coach, maybe the same one. They put the woman on a protocol of like Megaspore and Biocidin or something, like something really basic. And when the woman felt like crap on it and told the health coach said, well, I don't know what to tell you. I talked to my mentor and they said that they've never seen somebody react to those things, so it must just be you. Like, okay.
Oh, no.
It's not my protocol that's bad. Like, getting defensive, right? Like, it's not my protocol that's bad. Obviously, your body's broken or your body's weird or your experience of this is incorrect. And it's like, really? Like, well, aren't you curious?
And I do feel like, again, kind of stepping back from a situation like that, like, I almost feel like a lot of health coaches have so many issues with, like, disordered eating, orthorexia, like going too far down the rabbit hole too, and now they're like bringing people into that scenario, which is scary to me. But yeah, I think
it can happen in any profession.
Yeah, I mean, for sure.
I picked on the naturopaths when I go to Phoenix to the conference, and they won't go to a restaurant if it's not 100% organic. And I poke fun at them. I'm like, that's dysfunctional. Like, you know, it can happen in any profession, but I do see health coaches, for whatever reason, get, orthorexic sometimes with their nutritional recommendations and the way that they practice nutrition. But that's kind of a rabbit hole.
Yeah. I think it becomes like an identity almost. Like, I don't think like how I eat is my identity at all, you know? Yeah. But I feel like sometimes it does become that. But I guess we can get back to histamine.
Well, as a side note, too, I think that becomes more of an issue with, like, the labeled dietary templates. Like, I think that paleo people very much would say that, like, that being a paleo eater is part of their identity. And I think vegans, very much so, like, being a vegan is part of their identity. I think with histamine and oxalates and
I don't see that.
FODMAP, I think that most people have an understanding that it's a band-aid and it's like treating a medical thing. But definitely the diets that people get on by choice, and it's more of like a philosophical thing. Like, I don't eat meat because I'm better than you, or I don't eat grains because I'm better or smarter than you. Like, those are the people where, like, oh, 1000% yes. I've seen that very many times, that, like, it's part of their identity.
Yeah.
And then that can be hard to untangle. Keto. Sometimes keto is like that. I don't know if you've witnessed that too. But, like,
I've definitely seen that.
I would consider keto more like it's treating a medical thing. Like, if you're diabetic and then you do keto, like, you're trying to treat something. But it becomes this, like, I don't eat carbs because carbs are bad for you and it's a choice and I'm better than you. And obviously nobody's told me that to my face. But, like, I've seen keto be, like, an identity thing too, which is weird to me, because to me, keto, I don't know, like, keto is more in the ballpark of treating a medical condition, or it should be. Not like all humans need to be keto forever, end of story. Versus most paleo people and most vegan people will think that everybody needs to be paleo or vegan, end of story, because it's, like, the best. So it's funny how keto kind of strides the line between the two.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's funny you say that. There's the new season of Married at First Sight. One of the people that got married is, like, I think he's carnivore because he only eats steak and eggs. But he talks about it all the time. I'm like, okay, like, but I guess, like, if you only ate steak and eggs, like, I don't know. I just, like, I feel bad for the wife who married him, because it's like, okay, could you imagine being married to someone that's only eating steak and eggs with, like, no plan? He's done it for, like, 6 years. It was, like, a number of years, I remember right.
That would be shocking. Yeah. And, like, to give you guys the down low on this show, Married at First Sight, they're literally marrying strangers. Yeah. Like, they get set up by matchmakers, and they get married on TV, and then they're married for, what is it, like a month, and then they decide if they want to stay together or not. But, like, they literally just,
like, 2 months or something like that.
They throw you into marriage, they send you on a honeymoon, they move you in together, and they do matchmaking like it's supposed to be a good match. But these people have never met once in their entire lives before their wedding day. And I cannot even imagine being like, oh, BTW, like, what's your favorite food? Steak and eggs. Okay, what else do you like to eat? Literally nothing else. Like, what?
Right. And it's sad because I think his wife's, like, a foodie, like a bit of a foodie. Oh. Like, she likes, but I'm like, and this guy's kind of weird. In general, like, he's obsessed with the, like, everything's 80s, like, which, again, I don't mind the 80s, but like, he's super into the 80s and steak and eggs. That's, like, his thing. So, like, that's all he talks about is, like, working out, steak and eggs in the 80s.
I could get behind the 80s thing, but not the carnivore thing. We'll have to do an episode on carnivore at some point, but it's I've had some patients who have done carnivore before working with me, and it's been very fascinating hearing some of their stories and the changes, good and bad, that resulted from doing carnivore. Yeah. But going back to mast cells, okay, so infections, dysbiosis, mold. I will make a side note that another thing that can degranulate and piss off mast cells is toxins, which I realize is just as broad as stress or inflammation, and that doesn't actually help you. But I know, for example, like in one of my classes for my course, I included a slide where they showed that aluminum made mast cells degranulate. So as an example, like, be aware of things like metals, BPA, phthalates, parabens, anything that could be toxic or unhealthy to the human body could also perturb your mast cells. And I've had several patients who had, like, allergic type conditions or like mast cell histamine intolerant conditions. And then it turned out they had mold in their house. And then treating the mold and remediating made the histamine issues disappear. So mold is also a really, really, really big deal for the histamine mast cell kind of crowd. And then we already talked about stress. The stress hormones themselves, like corticotropin releasing factor, like we talked about last time, literally it's the stress hormones that make your mast cells degranulate. So it's not even like, if you approach stress as I historically have, like, oh, I can deal with this, I'm strong, whatever, shove it down. Like, you're still secreting the stress chemistry, even if you're fooling yourself into thinking you're not. You're still secreting stress chemistry. It's still going to happen. Actually, as a side note, I have treated my body like garbage for about a month, and I'm coming out of that now. And I have a prize winner of a PMS zit, which is very atypical for me. Like, I never get zits. And randomly, you probably can't see it on camera, but I have like the tiniest speck of what I feel like might be a touch of eczema on my arm. It's tiny. It's like the size of a dime, maybe. And it's just...
Oh, it's a cute eczema patch.
Right? And I realized it like right around when I started. Basically, I didn't take a day off. I worked all weekends for like a month. And I was like staying up late and stuff. Because I was re-recording all the content for my online course. And it was just like, it was a hot minute. But it was towards the beginning of that I was like, what have we here? And it's persisted. It's like my little buddy now. But I was surprised because I've never had like skin stuff in my life. I've never had eczema. I've never had, hives aside from when I had penicillin as a kid because I'm allergic. But I was like, okay, that's stress chemistry, degranulating some mast cells, pushing me into Th2 dominance. All right, I got the memo. So yesterday I got a massage and it was amazing. Nice.
Excellent. I don't want you working on weekends, Nikki. How can we stop this?
I know. Well, now it's done. I had to like get to this point. Yeah, it was just like I was trying to do 2 jobs at once and the only time to do it was on weekends. But now I'm better and I've gone to sleep early and I've taken some naps this week. This week is kind of my reset week because it's been a lot. But case in point, your body's going to tell you when it's pissed. It's just a matter of what you do with the information. Like, I could go cover this up with makeup and pretend it didn't exist, or I could tell you all about it and say, hey, this is what happens when you mistreat your body. I know because I've done it too. So, it is what it is.
I love it. But loud and proud.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Zitty and proud.
What are you going to name your eczema patch?
I don't know. I'm hoping it goes away, and that way I don't even have to name it. But it's kind of on its way out, it seems. But yeah, kind of peculiar.
Okay.
Yep. We'll see. Cool. Hopefully it doesn't wander back into my life again. But if it does, I'll know what's up. I'll know that I did something bad again. But yeah, so let's see. Where did we leave off with that thought, though? Okay, I think we covered a lot of the things that are going to make mast cells degranulate. The big ones being microbial in nature, whether that be SIBO, dysbiosis, infection, etc.
Yeah.
Anything toxic or inflammatory like, heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, stress. We cannot, if there's one at the top of this list, it's going to be stress. And number 2 for me would probably be mold, honestly.
Yeah.
So those are pretty important. What I think would be a good place to focus on now is some of the tools to help kind of calm and pacify the system. And there's a lot. There's like a gajillion different herbs and supplements that we could recommend. But what are some of your go-tos as far as like supplements for somebody who is histamine intolerant or on that spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. There's a lot of different options. I think sometimes in terms of nutrients, things like vitamin C is a mast cell stabilizer. So just making sure like diet's sufficient in that, or again, if taking a little bit more makes sense. Sometimes, again, I like quercetin. It's kind of a popular mast cell stabilizer.
And pretty cheap.
Yeah. So quercetin I like. Nettles is another one that I like a lot. Those would probably be the ones that I use. Sometimes I'll use blends. Like there's some blends that you can get that I like. Those would probably be the biggest things from like a supplemental standpoint. At times, again, certain people seem to like DAO, like taking an enzyme, a DAO enzyme with their meals. I've kind of had mixed results with that. I don't know how you feel about DAO. Like sometimes I feel like it's helpful, sometimes it's not. I still think it's not going to shut down the the histamine being released from your mast cells. So it can kind of, I think, digest maybe the histamine in your food, but not necessarily deal with stabilizing the mast cells from releasing so much histamine. But those would probably be the main ones that I see helping people.
Yeah. And I think actually you touched on something really good, which is you can have quote unquote histamine intolerance because you're not breaking down dietary histamine or you're consuming an excess of dietary histamine. Like that's kind of one variety. Yeah. The other variety is that if your mast cells are like right on the edge of degranulating and then you consume something that's allergenic or inflammatory or a known mast cell degranulator, then that can make the mast cells release their histamine. If you have that scenario going on, like if it's the food and it's like a allergy or sensitivity response provoking mast cells, those are the situations where DAO is not going to help you much. Right. And I've seen those cases where I always am like optimistic and I tell people try it and see what happens. Yeah. And some people, and I even, when I have people try DAO, I will have them kind of go all in and I'll be like, all right, what is one food that would be guaranteed to give you reflux or guaranteed to give you a histamine reaction? And they're like, oh, tomato sauce. Like everybody somehow on planet, every single person says tomato sauce. And I'm like, okay, would you be willing to be a scientist with me and eat like a spaghetti dinner with tomato sauce, but take like 3 of these DAO supplements and see what happens? And they're like, totally. Yeah, I can be miserable for one night. Why not? And that's usually like, it's a high enough dose and it's a high enough histamine thing that, you know, it's like if every other time they ate histamine or if every other time they ate pasta sauce for the last 10 years, they got a histamine response and then they take DAO and they're able to tolerate it reasonably well, like that's going to really stand out to people. And if I dose it high, like 3 or maybe 4 capsules with that meal, it's usually enough that if it's going to make a difference, we'll see some sort of shift with it. And some people will be like, hallelujah, this is the best thing in the whole universe. Oh my God, I love you. And then some people will be like, no, didn't really help. And I'm like, okay, we're thinking it's more your immune system cranking out histamine as opposed to you just consuming an excessive amount or not breaking it down. And you can have both, certainly, but that's one of my ways of going about it and trying to determine which side of that you're on. But for some people, those DAO supplements are like damn miracles. Right.
And, I know.
And it was off the market for a while. Like 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, there was about a year or a year and a half where the DAO supplements were entirely off the market. And all my poor histamine patients were like, what do we do? And we kind of made do. But yeah, it was rough going for a while there. I guess the company was getting bought out or sold or something, and they basically halted production during that time. But yeah, it was not a fun time to be a mast cell person in that moment.
Oh, no. Yeah.
But yeah, I do like DAO, especially like it's noteworthy too. Another mast cell degranulator is not a mast cell degranulator, but a thing that will perpetuate histamine intolerance is leaky gut. Because you make DAO in the brush border. So it's those cells that make up the gut lining. They make the enzyme that degrades histamine. So if you have a leaky gut, you're going to have naturally lower enzymes to take care of dietary histamine. So for some people, it's just that they need to heal the leaky gut and then the histamine thing will resolve.
Right.
But that's a consideration too. But yeah, for those people where it's like the leaky gut stuff and the DAO production is not there, those supplements could be a miracle worker. For other stuff, you know, I like what you said, quercetin, certainly. Luteolin is another one that you could use. It's kind of a similar antihistamine molecule. Nettles, I love. And actually now I don't really use it in capsules anymore. I usually have people make, like an infusion. Yeah. It's cool. It's like a really strong tea. So I have people, you take one of those bigger mason jars, like a quart mason jar with a lid, scoop in about 1 ounce of dried nettle leaf. It's pretty fluffy, so it'll be, you know, that much up the jar probably. Scoop in 1 ounce of nettle leaf and then pour boiling water over top of it and cap it. And then kind of like give it a shake or give it a stir and then leave it alone, leave it capped for like 3 or 4 hours. And then strain it And now you're getting the antihistamine. You're getting the nutritive value because nettle is very high in minerals when you prepare it that way. And also, it's kind of delightful tasting in a weird way. It smells like yard clippings. Like, it smells herbal at first. But if you try to take your first sip without getting the smell so much of it, because you're going to think you're drinking yard clippings. But if you can taste it, I think it actually tastes a little bit like almond milk. Which is really confusing. Again, like if I get a whiff first before I taste it, then I don't experience that as much. But if I kind of like strategize my breathing and I just take a sip and I'm like, kind of is like almond milk, I'll be damned. And then that kind of sits with me. But yeah, nettle, I make it in big batches for my husband in the spring because he's kind of an allergy sufferer when the pollen is really flying. So I'll make it in big jugs and keep it in the fridge for him, and I have him sipping that all day, every day in the spring. Nice. But it could be really, really helpful. And it's cheap, too. Like, the dried leaf, you can buy it by the pound at Mountain Rose Herbs or Star West Botanicals for, like, a pound of it for, like, $15, maybe.
Nice.
It's cheap. And it's so effective.
Cool. Yeah, I like nettles. I think that's a cool way to do it. Just kind of...
Yeah.
Get yourself a mason jar, get yourself some nettles.
Yep. Just go to town.
Yeah.
You could cook
make a
with
weekend out of it.
Yeah. Well, you could cook with fresh nettle leaves also. I have an herbal cookbook up here somewhere, and they have like nettle pesto and like all these fun recipes. I haven't found a big enough patch that I could like harvest it at all. Yeah. But side note, if you try to do this, or if you try to grow nettle in your garden, it likes damp places. It typically hangs out around like riverbeds and creeks and stuff. And also it's called stinging nettle for a reason. So make sure you wear gloves when you're handling it until you can once you cook the leaves, the stingers go away. But if you're picking it up when it's still a living plant, it's going to sting you. So wear gloves because it's kind of, it's not a very happy plant to pick up barehanded. But then get this. So here's a wild story. When I was at an herbal conference a couple years ago, and this woman was talking, and she's a naturopath and an herbalist, and she had practiced in the UK for years and years. And she was talking about when she worked at this clinic in like rural England somewhere. And she was saying that they would get like a lot of farmers, like sheep farmers and stuff, and they would do like herbal medicine. And this sheep farmer came in, and he said that he had bad seasonal allergies, but that he was treating it. And the herbalist and the naturopath, they were like, okay, well, how do you treat that? And he said, I use stinging nettle. And they were like, oh, great. Do you make a tea? Like, how do you use it? And he said, no. He said he goes out the first day or two of allergy season when it starts to get really bad and he's really congested. He would go way out in the back of his fields, find the crop of stinging nettle. I'm not even kidding. He would pick a bunch of stinging nettle, and with no shirt on, he would thrash himself with the nettle plants repeatedly, and he would get the stings from the stinging nettle plant all over his back and his shoulders. And he said he would be in a tremendous amount of pain for like 2 days, but then he had 0 allergies for the rest of the year.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
I just want to know, like, how he learned that. Like, what was the, like, was it like a pass down, or like, how do you just start like, I'm going to go pick this plant, thrash myself, make it hurt, and then I'm going to be good.
Right? It's really interesting. I have no idea how he would have learned that, but yeah, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall with those herbalists. Like, oh, you use stinging nettle. That's wonderful. Do you make a tea out of it? And he's like, no, man, I thrash myself with it. Like, what a weird experience for them. I don't know if I would have been able to keep a straight face. I think I just would have been deeply curious, and I would have asked him, like, how did you figure that out?
I would have had a lot of questions.
For sure. But, for what it's worth, dear viewers, I'm not endorsing doing that, but you could. If you're a person where you're like, I'm going to forget to take my nettle every day, what do I do? Maybe thrash yourself with the nettles. I don't know. It could work. But please don't. Don't go to the ER on my behalf. Should we insert a medical disclaimer right now? But yeah, what else was I going to say though? Yeah, quercetin, luteolin, vitamin C, certainly. Dow, we already mentioned. When it's appropriate, it can be really helpful.
Luteolin, just a question about luteolin. That's helpful for reflux, right? Or there's some reflux benefits, I thought.
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe. It wouldn't surprise me because the histamine receptor in the stomach triggers acid release. So that would make sense if it could be. I didn't know about that explicitly, though. I'll have to look it up. That's a good little nugget.
I remember, if I'm thinking of the luteolin, if I'm thinking of the right thing, I'm pretty sure there's been some stuff on reflux with it.
I'm going to Google it right now so I remember to look it up. I'll have to send you what I find, but yeah, I'll look it up. I'm not familiar with that, but that'd be really cool. And not surprising since histamine's involved.
Right.
But that might be handy for a couple of my gastritis and like really bad reflux patients right now who are struggling. So I might have to have them try that out. But yeah, I think those are a lot of the favorites. There's other, more exotic things. I think nutritionally, just making sure that you have B vitamins in your diet because methylation is part of the process of getting rid of histamine, like inside the cells, that is. So making sure that you have adequate levels of your B vitamins is never a bad idea. Riboflavin, you actually need riboflavin to make DAO. It's a cofactor for the enzyme, I think, if I remember correctly. So sometimes riboflavin, either in a multivitamin or as a standalone supplement, can be really helpful. And copper, to some extent, as well, can be helpful for like histamine degradation in the stomach. What about probiotics? Do you have any tidbits on that? I have some preliminary data I could share on that front.
Yeah, there's some like more histamine-free type probiotics that I try to use. Like if there is histamine-related things going on, sometimes we'll try like some other alternative approaches outside of probiotics first and kind of see how they respond. So it just kind of varies based on the person, from my standpoint when it comes to the probiotic side of things. Yeah. Do you have anything specific? You said that you're working on something. Something's in the works.
Well, sort of. I should have been a better scientist for the last couple of years. So I started the prokinetic experiment, right? And I did a debrief on my YouTube channel with the preliminary data on what prokinetic is the best. I've been doing a similar experiment with probiotics for way longer, but I've just been way crappier about tracking my data. / I have not until this year, or like 2020. So I have some vague sense going back in time, and then I have a little bit more data collection starting up now. But I've observed that a fair number of my histamine intolerant patients seem to like Claire Factor 6. Don't know why.
Interesting.
I don't know what's special about that particular probiotic. I don't know, but I will have patients do, one probiotic for 2 days, give themselves a day between, take another probiotic for 2 days, give them a day in between. And usually I'm fishing out the ones that people hate.
Yeah.
First and foremost. And then if we happen to find a good one in the mix, then fantastic. But I've observed several of my histamine intolerant patients or mast cell patients actually ended up all picking Factor 6, which was really surprising. I don't know if like the low histamine probiotics are necessarily necessary or if that's even an accurate statement, because how do we know? I don't even know. But yeah, Factor 6 might be worth looking into. It's expensive and it's very concentrated. Yeah. It's like 50 or 100 billion per capsule. So it's kind of pricey, but it can be helpful for some folks. And actually, I just had another patient who we hypothesized a bit of a histamine response with her. And that was one of like 3 products that she really liked. I think for her, there was like 3 or maybe 4 that she thought her body really agreed with. And that's the one that we ended up selecting going forward for now. So yeah, for what it's worth.
Oh, nice. Cool.
And this is just like internal data, but I have it documented in an Excel spreadsheet now. So now I can track the data more accurately. But, give me a year or two and I'll have more clear data like I do for the prokinetic experiment. Or it might just be a total mishmash and I might just say, damned if I know. But that is one pattern I've seen.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. And then, dear Amy, shall we wrap up by talking about mast cells as they relate specifically to IBS? Because that could have been one of the intro pieces, but that's okay. We'll wrap up with it. There's actually been a lot of research on mast cells and their involvement with IBS. So I do want to make sure that we make a note of that. Like, we're not just pulling this out of nowhere. You guys, this is actually something very well established in research. And like, there's been systemic reviews and meta-analyses, and like, this goes back a ways. So this is something that researchers have known about IBS for a long time now. But you want to weigh in on that a little bit, and then I will do the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, looking at some of the root causes of IBS that we can think of, like SIBO, stress, infections,
leaky gut,
toxins, like it's not surprising that there's a link between IBS and mast cell histamine issues when you kind of look at what drives histamine to be in higher concentrations in our bodies and our guts. So yeah, I think that like it makes sense when you see all the factors laid out. I'm not super surprised. Do I think that there should probably be more energy focused on the histamine side of things? Yes, like conventionally, I don't think anyone's talking about histamine and IBS. From the functional side of things, I think there might be some discussion, but I think it probably could be more. What's your kind of take on it? Anything specific?
Yeah, I'll say that the research I've seen, there's been a bunch of different efforts on this. Like, some labs have tried to quantify or look at the mast cells and like whether they're degranulated or not in the colon of patients with IBS versus controls. Yeah. Some papers have looked at the small bowel in IBS versus controls. And it's kind of hit and miss. I've seen some papers that say that there is, I forget now, it's either an increased quantity or a higher number of degranulated mast cells or both in the colon of irritable bowel syndrome patients. And then some papers say no. But if you think about it, like how many people with IBS actually have SIBO? And then a lot of their problem would be small bowel, not necessarily colon as much. So like, I think looking to the colon is probably not the complete picture with IBS anyway. Yeah. But some studies and some meta-analyses do show more degranulated mast cells or a higher number of mast cells in the colon in IBS patients. But the studies that I've seen that I thought were the most compelling were the mast cells, again, either the number of them or the degranulated versus not degranulated in some part of the small bowel, whether it's the duodenum, the jejunum, or the ileum. But that seems to be a little bit more consistent. And there's been some good quality data on that there's either more mast cells or more of them are degranulated in IBS patients versus controls. And there was even a paper kind of recently, like a month-ish ago, I want to say, where I think it was an animal study. I think it was a mouse study, but they basically said that a local histamine response in the gut is driving a lot of IBS-related food intolerances. But the key is that it's solely in the gut. So like if you take that person theoretically and try to test them for sensitivities and allergies in their peripheral blood, in the vein in their arm, it might not show up. It might just be local to the gut. So food for thought. But my dear, I have to wrap up because I am actually now I'm going to start wiggling in my chair because I have to pee so much. I have to pee too. Oh, twins.
Pee sisters.
So guys, Amy and I are going to pee. And you guys, you guys could pee right now too with us. So we invite you to pee with us. But sorry for the abrupt end, but I'm going to cut us off here. Per the normal, if you're listening on a podcasting app, we would deeply appreciate a 5-star review. If you are on YouTube, subscribe, ring the bell, comment, etc. And side note, I've started having my assistant work on gathering all of your comments from our YouTube channel so that we could do a question and answers episode for answering all of the questions that you have posted on our YouTube channel. So thank you for that. If you have questions, be sure to comment on YouTube and we will try to answer those in the near future. But Amy, I hope you have a wonderful pee, and I will too. And we will talk next week about the low histamine diet and how to use nutrition to modulate this whole squirrely world. So until next time, toodaloo, guys.